The doors of the summit hall had barely closed behind me when the laughter started. It was not the kind of laughter you hear at a joke. It was the kind that comes from someone who has already decided you are beneath them. Kryzek the Raven stood at the center of the chamber, nearly 7 feet tall, with skin like cracked stone and eyes the color of dying embers. He was looking straight at me, and he was smiling. "This is the great defender of Earth," he said, his voice booming through a translator collar. "A single soft creature, sent to stand among giants." I did not answer right away. My name is Ethan Cole, and 3 years ago, I was pulling wounded soldiers out of collapsed buildings on a planet nobody back home has ever heard of. Now I stood in a room full of alien delegates, wearing a security badge instead of a rifle, because the United Nations decided that humanity's first embassy needed someone who knew how to stay calm when things went wrong. Things were going wrong. "You mock a species you know nothing about," said Grace Bennett, our ambassador, standing beside me. Her voice was steady, but I could see her hands were not. Kryzek turned toward her slowly, enjoying every second of the silence he created. "I know enough. Your kind has no war fleet. No colonies beyond one small system, no history among the stars. You are newborns pretending to sit at the table of adults." The other delegates in the room, a mix of species I still could not always tell apart, watched without interfering. This was not their fight. Not yet. "The Ashvane Dominion has a tradition," Kryzek continued, walking closer, each step slow and deliberate, like a predator that already knows it does not need to hurry. "The right of contest, a duel between one warrior from each side. If your champion loses, your species forfeits its claim to this sector. No fleets, no committees. Just strength, proven in front of witnesses." Grace stepped forward. "We are not interested in duels. We are here to negotiate territory rights peacefully." "Then you have already lost," Kryzek said, "because peace is not a language my people respect." He looked around the room, at the dozen or so alien officials seated at the long curved table, and then back at me. I was the only human in that hall, wearing anything resembling a combat posture. Everyone else was in diplomatic robes. I was in a plain gray uniform with my arms crossed, trying to look like nothing about this conversation frightened me. "You," Kryzek said, pointing directly at me, "you carry yourself like a soldier. Perhaps you are the one who should answer for your species." The room went quiet. I felt Grace's eyes on me, silently begging me not to say anything foolish. Here is the truth. If I refused, Kryzek would tell every species in that hall that humanity was too afraid to defend itself, and within a week, our new embassy would be surrounded by ships instead of diplomats. If I accepted, I would be facing something built like a walking tank, with reflexes shaped by a lifetime of combat, and I had no idea what weapons or rules would even apply. But there was one thing I understood, something I had learned a long time ago, in situations just as bad as this one. Fear is loud in the room, but it does not have to be loud in your voice. "I accept," I said. The words landed heavier than I expected. A few of the alien delegates shifted in their seats. Kryzek's smile widened, showing rows of sharp gray teeth. "Good," he said. "Then let it be settled the old way. 3 days from now, at the Ashvane Proving Ground. First blood, or first surrender." Grace grabbed my arm the moment he turned away, her nails digging in through my sleeve. "Ethan, what are you doing? Do you have any idea what that thing has done to people who challenged him?" "I have a rough idea," I said quietly. "He has killed champions from 6 different species," she whispered. 6. Not defeated. Killed. "Then I guess I'll be careful not to become the 7th. She did not find that funny. Neither did I, honestly. But confidence is sometimes the only weapon you have left, and I was not about to let a room full of strangers watch me lose it. Kryzek's translator picked up a low sound from his throat, something between a growl and a laugh, as he walked past 2 of his own officers. "The humans send children to speak with warriors," he said, loud enough for the whole hall to hear. "This will be over before it begins." I let him have the last word. I have learned that men who need the last word usually need it because they are afraid of the silence that comes after. As the delegates began filing out of the hall, whispering to each other in languages my translator could barely keep up with, Grace pulled me aside into a quiet corridor. Her face had lost its calm diplomatic mask. "You You cannot beat him physically, she said. He is nearly twice your size. His people have bones reinforced with natural mineral plating. I read the reports, Ethan. He has survived weapons fire at close range. I'm not planning to outmuscle him, I said. Then what exactly is your plan? I did not have one yet. Not really. But I had 3 days, and 3 days was enough time to learn something Kryzek clearly had not bothered to learn about me. I'm going to find out how he fights, I said. Every warrior has patterns. Every species has instincts they don't even realize they're following. He's spent his whole life being feared. That means he spent his whole life being obeyed. People who are always obeyed stop expecting to be surprised. Grace studied me for a long moment. You really believe that's going to be enough? I believe it's the only thing I've got, I said, and I intend to use it. Behind us, through the tall glass windows of the embassy corridor, I could see Kryzek's personal transport lifting off the landing platform, its dark hull cutting across the orange evening sky like a blade. Somewhere on that ship, I imagined him already celebrating, already certain of how this story would end. He had made one mistake, though, and he did not even know it yet. He had mocked a species that had spent its entire history being underestimated, by nature, by disaster, by its own worst moments, and had somehow always found a way to still be standing at the end. I intended to remind him of that. That night, I sat alone, in the small quarters assigned to embassy staff, staring at a blank data pad, trying to figure out where to even begin. I was not a scientist. I was not a diplomat. I was a soldier who had been given a badge instead of a weapon, thrown into a fight I never trained for, against an opponent who had already won dozens of times before. But I had survived things before by refusing to fight on someone else's terms. I opened a channel to the embassy's small research division and typed a single request. Send me everything you have on the Ashvane Dominion. Everything. Their history, their duels, their culture. I don't care how small the detail is. 3 days was not much time. It was going to have to be enough. Outside my window, the twin moons of this outpost world hung low over the horizon, pale and distant, watching over a fight that had not even started yet, but had already begun to change everything. The first strike had not been thrown, but the war of minds already had. I did not sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Kryzek's smile, wide and certain, the smile of someone who had never once considered losing. I kept thinking about the 6 champions before me, 6 warriors from 6 different species, each one probably stronger, faster, better trained in combat than I would ever be, and all 6 of them had lost. That told me something important. It told me this was not a fight that could be won through strength alone. If it could be, one of those 6 would have found a way. Somewhere in those 6 defeats was a pattern, a shape, a weakness that nobody else had noticed because they were too busy trying to match Kryzek's power instead of understanding his mind. I intended to be the first person who studied him instead of fearing him. By the time the sun rose over the embassy compound, I had made a decision. I was not going to train my body for the next 3 days. I did not have time to build the kind of strength that would matter against something like Kryzek. Instead, I was going to spend every waking hour learning who he was, how he moved, how he thought, and most importantly, how he expected his opponents to behave. Because if there is one thing every predator in the galaxy has in common, it is this. They grow careless around prey they believe they already understand. Kryzek believed he understood humans. I intended to make sure he was wrong. The research division sent me more files than I could read in a week, let alone 3 days. Battle records, cultural studies, old diplomatic reports from species who had crossed paths with the Ashvane Dominion long before humanity ever left its own solar system. I sat in a small briefing room with the lights dimmed, cups of cold coffee stacking up beside me, and I went through every single page I could. The first thing I learned was that the Ashvane were not simply violent, they were structured. Every duel, every conflict, every act of aggression followed a strict set of unwritten rules passed down for generations. Kryzek was not some wild animal swinging blindly at anything in front of him. He was a product of tradition, and tradition, I realized, is just another word for pattern. I watched recordings of his 6 previous duels, more times than I could count. The first one was against a Velkari war priest, a species known for defensive fighting styles built around endurance. The duel lasted less than a minute, Kryzek opened with an aggressive forward strike, a move meant to end the fight immediately, testing whether his opponent would freeze, retreat, or counter. The Velkari priest hesitated for less than a second, and that hesitation cost him everything. The second duel was similar. So was the third. By the fourth, I noticed something that made my chest tighten with a strange mixture of fear and hope. Kryzek always opened the same way. Every single time. A direct, overwhelming first strike, designed less to win the fight outright, and more to break his opponent's confidence in the very first exchange. It was not a fighting style built around adapting to an opponent. It was a fighting style built around intimidation. He was not trying to defeat 6 different warriors using 6 different strategies. He was using one strategy over and over again, because it had worked every single time before. Nobody had ever survived the opening move long enough to force him to think of a second one. I sat back in my chair and allowed myself, for the first time since accepting the challenge, a small breath of something close to hope. If Kryzek always opened the same way, then the opening was not a mystery. It was a variable I could prepare for. The next morning, Grace found me still in the briefing room, surrounded by scattered notes and half-finished diagrams sketched across a datapad. She looked like she had not slept either. "You look terrible," she said, setting down a fresh cup of coffee in front of me. "Thank you," I said. "You always know how to make a man feel confident before facing possible death." She almost smiled, but the worry in her eyes did not fade. "Tell me you found something useful in all of this." "I found a pattern," I said. Kryzek opens every fight the same way, a direct overwhelming strike, meant to end things immediately or shatter his opponent's confidence. He has never had to move past that first move, because nobody has ever survived it long enough to force a second one. Grace sat down across from me, arms crossed. "And you think you can survive it?" "I think I can avoid it," I said. "There's a difference." "How?" I pulled up a recording from the third duel, slowing it down frame by frame. Watch his stance right before he moves. His weight shifts to his back leg. His shoulders rotate slightly before the strike even begins. It's small, almost invisible if you're not looking for it, but it's there, every single time. Grace leaned closer, studying the frozen image on the screen. "You're saying he telegraphs his attack?" "Every warrior does, in some way," I said. "Most people just aren't trained to notice it, especially not when they're staring down someone twice their size and trying not to panic. But I've spent years reading body language in combat zones where hesitation gets people killed. I know what to look for." "And if you're right? If you dodge his first strike, what happens then?" That was the part I had not fully solved yet. "Then for the first time in his life," I said slowly, "Kryzek the Raven has to think of a second move." Grace was quiet for a long moment. "You understand that even if your theory is correct, he is still faster and stronger than you. Avoiding one attack does not win a duel." "No," I agreed, "but it changes the fight. Right now, he believes this is already decided. He believes I am afraid, uncertain, already defeated in my own mind. If I show him something he has never seen before, even for a single moment, I take away the one advantage he has never had to fight without. Which is certainty," I said. Over the next 2 days, I did not touch a single weapon. Instead, I studied everything I could find about Ashvane culture, their honor codes, the rules that governed the right of contest. It turned out those rules were more specific than I expected, and more important than Kryzek probably realized when he issued his challenge in front of witnesses. The right of contest was not simply a fight to the death. It was a formal, sacred tradition, and like most sacred traditions, it came with conditions that even a warlord could not ignore without consequence. According to the oldest recorded texts, a duel could be won not only through incapacitation, but through forced surrender, and any warrior who abandoned the honor code mid-duel, through excessive brutality or by breaking the agreed terms, would be stripped of status among his own people, regardless of the outcome. In other words, Kryzek could not simply overpower me by any means necessary. If he lost control, if he abandoned tradition out of frustration or anger, he would lose something far more valuable to him than a single duel. He would lose respect among his own warriors, and for a leader like him, that kind of loss could be more dangerous than losing the fight itself. I began to understand something important. This was not only a physical contest. It was a performance, watched by witnesses whose opinions mattered to Kryzek far more than mine ever would. If I could force him to break his own tradition in front of those witnesses, even without defeating him outright, I could damage him in a way that no physical strike ever could. On the final evening before the duel, Grace found me standing outside the embassy compound, staring up at the dark sky, watching a distant cluster of stars I still did not know the names of. "You've been quiet all day," she said, standing beside me. "Just thinking," I said. "About the duel?" "About home," I admitted. "About how strange it is that 3 days ago I was standing in a summit hall being mocked in front of a room full of strangers, and tomorrow I might become the reason humanity is either respected or erased from a sector we just arrived in." Grace was silent for a moment. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think you're going in there blind anymore. I've watched you these past 3 days. You didn't train your body, you trained your mind. That's not nothing." "It might not be enough," I said honestly. "No," she agreed, "but it's more than any of the 6 who came before you had." I looked at her, surprised by the certainty in her voice. "They went in expecting to fight a monster," she continued. "You went in trying to understand a person. Even a dangerous, arrogant person still follows patterns, still has pride, still has weaknesses hidden underneath all that strength. You found some of them in 3 days. That matters." I did not answer right away. Instead, I thought about Kryzek's smile in that summit hall, the certainty in his voice when he called me a child sent to speak with warriors. I thought about the 6 champions who never got a second move, because nobody before me had ever taken the time to study the first one. Tomorrow, I intended to give him a fight he had never faced before. Not because I was stronger. Not because I was faster. But because for the first time in a long time, Kryzek the Raven was about to face someone who had already seen him coming. As I turned to walk back inside, one last thought settled over me, quiet but certain. He had spent his whole life being feared. Tomorrow, he was going to learn what it felt like to be surprised. The Ashvane Proving Ground was carved into a wide stone basin, surrounded on all sides by tall rocky cliffs that rose like the walls of an ancient arena. There were no seats, no stadium lights, no announcers, just open ground, cold morning air, and a crowd of warriors and delegates gathered along the upper ridges, watching in complete silence as I walked out onto the sunken field alone. I could feel their eyes on me before I even reached the center of the ground, some curious, some amused. A few, mostly Ashvane warriors, dressed in dark ceremonial armor, watched with open contempt, the same look Kryzek had given me back in the summit hall 3 days earlier. Grace stood at the edge of the ridge with the rest of the human delegation, her arms crossed tightly, her face unreadable, though I knew her well enough by now to see the tension behind her calm expression. She had told me that morning, quietly, before I left the embassy transport, that whatever happened, humanity would remember what I chose to do here today. I had not found that comforting. I found it heavier than anything Kryzek had said to me so far. A low horn sounded from somewhere above the cliffs, deep and resonant, and the crowd shifted its attention toward the far end of the basin. Kryzek the Raven stepped out onto the field. He was dressed differently than he had been at the summit, no longer in formal robes but in dark battle plating that hugged his massive frame, leaving his arms bare, showing off skin like cracked volcanic rock. He carried no weapon. According to Ashvane tradition, the rite of contest was fought unarmed, a test of raw combat skill rather than technology or tools. That detail had worried me more than almost anything else in my research. Kryzek did not need a weapon. His body was one. He crossed the distance between us slowly, each step deliberate, his eyes locked on mine the entire time, studying me the way a predator studies something it has already decided is beneath serious consideration. "You look pale, human," he said, his translator collar carrying his voice across the open ground. "Do humans lose their color when they are afraid?" "I look this way most days," I said. "You get used to it." A few of the Ashvane warriors on the ridge exchanged glances at that. I could not tell if it was surprise or irritation, but either way, it was a reaction, and reactions meant I had already done something none of the previous 6 champions apparently managed to do. Kryzek's smile faltered for the briefest moment, then returned, wider than before. Confidence in the face of death is common among young species. It rarely lasts. "We'll see," I said. An Ashvane official stepped forward between us, dressed in pale ceremonial cloth, and began reciting the rules of the rite of contest in a slow, formal tone. I barely listened. I already knew the rules better than most of the people standing on that ridge. First blood or surrender ends the contest. No weapons, no outside interference, and, most importantly, the part I intended to use against Kryzak if given the chance. Any warrior who abandoned honorable combat in favor of excessive brutality would forfeit standing among his people, regardless of the outcome. The official finished speaking and stepped back, raising one hand into the air. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I had experienced during my years of service back on Earth. I focused on my breathing, slow and steady, the way I had trained myself to do years ago, in moments when panic wanted to take over completely. Kryzak shifted his weight. Just slightly, just enough. His weight rolled back onto his rear leg. His shoulders rotated a fraction of an inch, exactly the way I had watched him do in 6 different recordings, over and over again, until the motion was burned into my memory. The official's hand dropped. Kryzak moved. He came at me like a landslide, fast and enormous, his forward strike aimed directly at my chest, with enough force behind it to end the fight in a single motion. It was the same opening move he had used in every previous duel, the same overwhelming first strike that had shattered the confidence of 6 warriors before they even had time to think. But I had already seen it coming. I pivoted at the last possible moment, turning my body sideways, letting his massive arm pass just inches from where my chest had been a heartbeat earlier. The force of his miss carried him forward, off balance for the first time in 6 duels, his own momentum working against him instead of for him. I heard the crowd on the ridge react, a sharp collective intake of breath, followed by murmurs I could not fully translate, but understood perfectly well anyway. Kryzak had missed. For the first time in his career, in front of witnesses from across the sector, Kryzak Tharavan had thrown his opening strike and hit nothing but empty air. I did not hesitate. I could not afford to. I used his forward momentum against him, driving my palm into the side of his extended arm, redirecting his own force further off balance, sending him stumbling forward with a grunt of surprise that echoed across the stone basin. It was not a strong hit. I was not strong enough to hurt him with brute force, and I knew that going in. But it did not need to be strong. It only needed to be unexpected. Kryzak caught himself before falling completely, spinning around to face me again, and for the first time since I had met him, his expression had changed. The smile was gone. "You dodged," he said, his voice lower now, edged with something that had not been there before. Not quite anger, something closer to disbelief. "I studied," I said. His eyes narrowed. "Studied what?" "You," I said simply. The crowd on the ridge had gone quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet now. Not the bored silence of an audience expecting a quick and predictable ending, something more alert, more uncertain. Kryzak's jaw tightened, and I saw something shift behind his ember-colored eyes. The look of a man who had built his entire reputation on one devastating first strike, and had just discovered, in front of everyone who mattered to him, that his opponent had not only survived it, but expected it. "A trick," he growled. "Nothing more." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe you've spent so long fighting opponents who were too afraid to look closely at you, that you forgot someone eventually would." He roared and came at me again. Faster this time. Less controlled. Less patient. This was no longer the same calculated opening strike from before. This was frustration given motion, and frustration, I had learned a long time ago, made even the most dangerous opponents predictable, in different, sloppier ways. I ducked beneath his swinging arm, feeling the wind of it pass just above my head, close enough that I felt the heat off his skin. I drove forward, using his own forward motion again, redirecting rather than resisting, a technique I had studied in old defensive fighting styles, designed specifically for opponents far larger and stronger than the person using them. He stumbled again, this time harder, catching himself on one knee before rising back to his full height, breathing heavier now, his composure cracking further with every second that passed, without the quick, decisive victory he had expected. Around us, the crowd on the ridge had grown louder, voices overlapping in a dozen different languages, some sounding excited, others clearly unsettled by what they were witnessing. This was not how the rite of contest was supposed to go. This was not how it had ever gone before. Kryzek straightened, wiping a thin line of dust and dirt from his cracked stone skin. His ember eyes locked on me with an intensity that had shifted from confidence into something far more dangerous. Wounded pride. "You have been fortunate twice," he said. "Fortune does not last." "Maybe not," I said, keeping my voice as calm and level as I could manage, despite the pounding of my own heart. "But it doesn't have to last forever. It just has to last long enough." He came at me a third time, and this attack was different from the first two. Slower, more controlled, more deliberate, as if he had finally forced himself to stop relying purely on instinct and started actually thinking about how to adjust to an opponent who refused to behave the way he expected. This time, I could not avoid him completely. His arm caught my shoulder as I tried to sidestep, and the impact sent a sharp burst of pain through my entire body, spinning me sideways and down onto the hard stone ground. I hit hard, the breath forced out of my lungs, my vision blurring for a brief, disorienting moment. The crowd above went silent again, waiting. I forced myself back onto my feet before he could close the distance completely, my shoulders screaming in protest, my breathing ragged, but I kept my eyes locked on his, refusing to let him see anything close to fear on my face, even though fear was very much present underneath the surface. Kryzek stood over me, closer now than he had been at any point in the fight so far, close enough that I could see every crack and ridge across his stone-like skin, close enough to hear the low growl building in his throat. "Yield," he said. "There is no shame in it. You have already proven more than any before you." For a moment, the offer almost sounded genuine. A small part of me, exhausted and aching, wanted to consider it seriously. But I thought about Grace, standing on that ridge, watching with the rest of the human delegation. I thought about the summit hall 3 days earlier, about the way Kryzek had smiled while calling humanity children pretending to sit among giants. I thought about what it would mean, not just for me, but for every human being who would come after me, if the very first contest our species faced among the stars ended in surrender. "No," I said. His eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Then this ends now," he said, and came at me one final time, faster and harder than before, abandoning the last traces of ritual and control entirely, driven purely by anger and the growing, unfamiliar fear that he might actually lose. I saw the shift coming, the same way I had seen his first strike coming 3 days of study earlier, and in that final moment, as his massive frame closed the distance between us with terrifying speed, I understood exactly what I needed to do. Not to defeat him through strength, but to force him into a mistake big enough for every witness on that ridge to see clearly, a mistake that would cost him something far more valuable than a single duel: his honor. I stepped sideways at the very last instant, not fully avoiding him this time, but shifting just enough to turn his final rushing attack into something clumsy and overextended. He crashed past me, his balance thrown completely off, and this time, there was nothing graceful about his stumble. He hit the stone ground hard, dust rising around him, the sound echoing across the basin like a small collapse. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Kryzek pushed himself upright, faster than I expected, fury replacing whatever control had remained in his expression. He turned toward me, and I saw immediately that something had changed. This was no longer the calculated warlord who had walked onto the field with total certainty. This was a wounded predator, embarrassed in front of his own people, and embarrassment, I had learned from years of watching people under pressure, often made things far more dangerous before it made them safer. He came at me again, but this time there was nothing resembling the disciplined opening strike from before. This was raw aggression, wild and unpredictable, arms swinging with a strength that could end the fight in a single connected blow. I ducked one strike, felt the wind of a second pass close enough to graze my arm, and threw myself backward to create distance, my lungs burning, my shoulder throbbing where his earlier hit had landed. I was not winning this fight through endurance. I knew that clearly now. My body could not survive many more direct hits like the one I had already taken. But I did not need to win through endurance. I needed him to keep losing control in front of witnesses who cared deeply about tradition and honor. "You call this the rite of contest," I said. forcing the words out despite my ragged breathing, loud enough for the crowd above to hear clearly. Where is the honor in this? You are not fighting like a warrior anymore. You are fighting like someone who is afraid of what happens if he loses. The words landed exactly where I intended them to. Kryzek froze mid-motion, his ember eyes flashing with something raw and furious. You know nothing of my honor, he snarled. I know your own rules, I said. I know that a warrior, who abandons the sacred terms of combat, out of anger, out of fear, forfeits standing among his people regardless of the outcome. I studied that too. Did you think I only studied your first strike? I saw the moment the words registered fully, saw his eyes flick briefly toward the ridge above, toward the rows of Ashvane warriors watching in complete silence, their expressions unreadable but their attention absolute. For a species built entirely around honor and tradition, being accused publicly of abandoning both was not a small thing. It was, perhaps, the single most damaging accusation anyone could make. Silence, he growled, though the certainty in his voice had cracked slightly. You mocked my species 3 days ago, I continued, refusing to back down now that I finally had him hesitating. You called us children. You said this would be over before it began, and now here we are, and the only person breaking tradition on this field is you. A murmur rippled through the crowd above, quiet but unmistakable. I could not understand every word being spoken in every different language up there, but I understood the tone well enough. Doubt, uncertainty, questions being raised about the warlord they had all believed was untouchable. Kryzek's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his enormous frame trembling with barely controlled anger, and for a moment, I genuinely believed he might abandon the rules completely, might close the distance between us, with a strike meant purely to end things, regardless of consequence. But something held him back. Pride, maybe. Or the sudden, dawning awareness that every additional mistake he made in front of these witnesses was another crack in a reputation he had spent decades building. You think words will save you, he said finally, his voice lower now, more controlled, though the anger underneath had not faded at all. No, I said. I think the truth will. And the truth is, you built your entire legend on opponents who never got the chance to see you clearly. I saw you, I studied you, and now everyone up on that ridge is starting to see you too. He stared at me for a long moment, chest rising and falling heavily, and I could see him fighting an internal battle far more difficult than the physical one we had just been engaged in. The instinct to end this through overwhelming force, against the growing awareness that doing so, in this moment, in front of these particular witnesses, would cost him something he could never fully win back. Slowly, deliberately, he straightened his posture, forcing his breathing to steady, forcing the wild aggression from moments earlier back under some semblance of control. You are clever, he said finally. I will grant you that. But cleverness does not win contests of strength. No, I agreed. But it can decide who actually deserves to win one. He came at me again, and this time the attack was different once more. Slower, more measured, as if he had finally accepted that treating me like every previous opponent was no longer working. This was a warrior, adjusting, adapting, trying to find a new pattern after being forced, for the first time, to abandon the only one he had ever needed before. I met his approach with everything I had left, using the terrain around us, the uneven stone ground, the shifting angle of the morning light behind me. Anything and everything that might create even the smallest advantage. I was not going to win through strength. I had accepted that from the very beginning. My only path forward was to keep making him think, keep making him hesitate, keep denying him the one thing his entire reputation had always depended on. Certainty. We traded exchanges across the field for what felt like an eternity, though I later learned it had only been a few more minutes. Every strike I managed to avoid cost him something small but meaningful. Every moment I remained standing, chipped away further at the myth surrounding him, and every time he glanced toward the ridge above, checking the reaction of his own people, I saw the weight of that scrutiny pressing down on him more heavily than any physical blow I could have landed. Finally, exhausted, wounded, barely able to keep my stance steady, I saw the opening I had been waiting for. Kryzek overextended on a final desperate strike, his balance shifting too far forward, his guard dropping just enough. I did not have the strength left to overpower him through force. But I did not need to. I stepped into the gap he had created, using his own momentum one final time, and drove my forearm across the side of his exposed jaw with everything I had left in my body. It was not a devastating blow. Against a warrior built like Kryzek, it likely did no serious physical damage at all. But it connected, cleanly, undeniably, in front of every single witness gathered along that ridge. First blood, according to the ancient rules of the rite of contest, did not require overwhelming force. It required only a clear, undeniable strike, landed under the recognized terms of honorable combat. Kryzek staggered backward, one hand rising slowly to touch the thin line of dark liquid now visible along his jaw, staring at his own fingers as if he could not quite believe what he was seeing. Silence fell across the entire basin. Even the wind seemed to still. Kryzek stood frozen, staring at the dark line across his fingers, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something in his ember-colored eyes that had nothing to do with anger or arrogance. It looked, more than anything else, like disbelief. The Ashvane official who had recited the rules earlier stepped forward slowly, his pale ceremonial robes catching the morning light, his gaze moving between Kryzek and me with careful, measured attention. According to the ancient terms of the rite of contest, first blood, drawn under recognized conditions of honorable combat, was enough to end the duel. First blood has been drawn, the official announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent basin. The contest is decided. For a moment, nobody moved. Then a low murmur began rippling through the crowd, gathered along the ridge, growing steadily louder, spreading from one cluster of witnesses to the next. I could not understand every word being spoken in every different language, but the tone was unmistakable. Shock, disbelief, and underneath all of it, something that almost sounded like awe. Kryzek did not speak right away. He stood there, chest still rising and falling heavily, staring at me across the short distance that remained between us, and for the first time since our confrontation began 3 days earlier, I saw him truly looking at me, not as prey, not as an easy target sent by a species he considered beneath him, but as something else entirely. An opponent. "How?" he said finally, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it, stripped of its earlier arrogance completely. "How does someone who has never fought a war defeat a warlord who has never lost?" I took a slow breath, trying to steady myself despite the exhaustion pulling at every part of my body. My shoulder throbbed, my legs felt unsteady beneath me, but I forced myself to stand as straight as I could manage, because I understood, even in that moment, that how I carried myself now would matter just as much as anything I had done during the fight itself. "You didn't lose because I was stronger," I said. "You lost because you never expected anyone to actually study you. You built an entire reputation on being unpredictable and terrifying to opponents who were too afraid to look closely. Nobody ever took the time to understand your patterns, because nobody ever survived long enough to try." Kryzek's jaw tightened, but he did not argue. "My people have a saying," he said instead, slowly, choosing his words with unusual care. "The strongest storm still follows the shape of the wind that carries it." I always believed that meant strength itself was the storm. He paused, glancing briefly at the thin mark still visible along his jaw. Perhaps I misunderstood which part of the saying mattered most. The crowd along the ridge had grown quieter now, watching this exchange with an intensity that felt different from the excitement of the fight itself. This was something else. Something that would be remembered and repeated, long after the physical details of the duel had faded from memory. The Ashvane official stepped forward again, addressing the gathered crowd in a formal, resonant tone. "By the ancient terms of the rite of contest, the human champion has claimed victory through first blood, achieved under recognized conditions of honorable combat. The human delegation's claim to this sector stands unchallenged." A wave of reaction moved through the crowd, some voices rising in clear astonishment, others murmuring quietly among themselves, exchanging glances that suggested entire assumptions about the newest species to arrive among the stars were being quietly, permanently rewritten. Kryzek remained still for a long moment, before finally lowering himself into a slow, deliberate bow, a gesture that clearly cost him something significant, given the stiffness in his posture and the tightness around his eyes. "You have earned this victory," he said. "I will not dishonor it by pretending otherwise in front of my own people." It was, I realized, Probably the closest thing to genuine respect Kryzek Tharavan had ever offered anyone. I did not have the strength left to say anything particularly memorable in return. Instead, I simply nodded, once, acknowledging the gesture without pretending the moment needed grand words to matter. Grace reached me moments later, practically running down from the ridge, her earlier composed diplomatic expression completely abandoned in favor of open relief and disbelief in equal measure. "You're insane," she said, gripping my uninjured shoulder carefully, checking me over with quick, worried eyes. "Completely, absolutely insane." "Probably," I admitted, my voice rough with exhaustion. "But it worked." "It worked," she repeated, almost laughing, though there was a shakiness underneath it that told me exactly how frightened she had actually been watching from that ridge. "Ethan, do you understand what you just did? You didn't just win a duel. You just told every species in this sector that humanity cannot be dismissed, cannot be underestimated, and cannot be intimidated into silence." I looked past her, up toward the ridge, where the crowd of delegates and warriors from a dozen different species were still gathered, watching, whispering, recalculating everything they thought they understood about the newest arrivals to the galactic stage. "I didn't do that alone," I said. "I just refused to lose the way everyone expected me to." Word of what happened on that stone basin spread faster than I ever could have anticipated. Within days, the story had reached embassies and outposts across the sector, retold and reshaped with each telling, though the core details remained consistent enough. A single human, facing a warlord who had never lost, who had mocked an entire species as children unworthy of respect, had studied his opponent instead of fearing him, and had turned that opponent's own overwhelming strength into the very weakness that ended the fight. I received messages in the days that followed from delegates I had never even met, expressing interest in trade agreements, defense partnerships, cultural exchanges, all of it flowing toward Earth's small embassy, with a speed that would have seemed impossible just 1 week earlier. Species that had previously ignored our diplomatic requests entirely suddenly found reasons to schedule meetings. Species that had quietly aligned with the Ashvane Dominion, out of fear, began reconsidering where their loyalties truly belonged. Kryzek himself never publicly spoke about the duel again, at least not in any official capacity that reached our embassy, but I heard, through indirect channels and second-hand reports passed along by other delegates, that his standing among his own people had shifted noticeably. Not destroyed entirely, but softened, questioned in ways it had never been questioned before. Other warlords across the sector, apparently, had taken quiet notice as well. The easy assumption that humanity represented a soft, harmless, insignificant new arrival had been permanently disrupted. I spent the following week recovering in the embassy's small medical wing, my shoulder wrapped and healing slowly. Plenty of time to reflect on everything that had happened since Kryzek first laughed at me across that summit hall. I thought often about the 6 champions who came before me, warriors from other species who had likely trained their entire lives for combat, who had almost certainly been stronger and faster than I ever was, and who had still lost, because nobody before me had ever taken the time to actually understand the man behind the reputation. Strength, I realized, was never really the deciding factor in that duel. Understanding was. Grace visited me during my recovery, sitting quietly beside my bed one evening as the twin moons outside the window climbed slowly into the darkening sky. "You know," she said, "before all of this, I was terrified we were going to lose everything within our first month among the stars. One bad diplomatic mistake, one wrong move, and Earth would have been remembered as the species that arrived just long enough to be erased." "And now?" I asked. She smiled, a small, tired, genuine smile. "Now I think people are starting to remember us as the species that refuses to be predictable. That might end up being worth more than any fleet or territory claim ever could." I thought about that for a long time after she left, staring up at the ceiling of the small medical room, listening to the quiet hum of the embassy compound settling into another evening. Kryzek had mocked me, mocked all of humanity, standing in that summit hall with absolute certainty that he already understood exactly what kind of opponent he was facing. He had built his entire reputation on that same overwhelming first strike, confident that no one would ever take the time to look closely enough to see it coming. He had been wrong, not because humans were naturally stronger, or faster, or more skilled in combat than the countless other species scattered across this sector of the galaxy. We were not by a long distance, But we had learned, throughout our own complicated, difficult history, that survival rarely belonged to the strongest. It belonged to whoever adapted quickest, whoever refused to accept the story someone else had already written for them, whoever kept standing back up long after they were expected to stay down. Kryzek had thrown his first strike expecting an easy, predictable ending. Instead, he had given humanity its very first legend among the stars, and somewhere out there, across a sector full of species, still trying to understand exactly what kind of neighbor they had just gained, I suspected that legend was only just beginning. This had been our first contest. It would not be our last, and whatever challenges waited for us further out among those distant, unfamiliar stars, I found myself, for the first time since arriving at that summit hall 3 days before the duel, genuinely unafraid to meet them. Because now, at least, one thing had changed permanently. Nobody in this sector would ever again assume that humanity could be easily underestimated. They had learned, the hard way, exactly what happens when you mock the wrong species and throw the first strike, without ever truly understanding who you were striking at.